You have a great book, and I do refer to it in mine, but that's why I wrote my book. I think the heart of leadership is human connection. It's very simple, right? And really, when I started out in my career and throughout the 40 years that I've been working, I've observed different leadership styles, and they can make a huge difference on a person, positively or negatively, and even impact their personal life, not just their professional life. Right?
Right.
That's really something important that people miss. So I think the only way really to be a good leader is to be a caring leader. Servant leaders used often lead with the heart and adding more humanity to leadership. And really, that's the whole idea why I wrote my book, because I think that's an absolutely important message.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's one of the things about whether you want to call it a caring leadership like you do or the other terms you use is that I think people think that's one dimensional leadership sometimes when they see it, and they don't. This is a great book. And I'm going to forget the author's name, or forgive me when if they see this, but it's called "Why Should Anyone Be Led by You?" I think one of them is Goff. I can't remember the other, but they talk about in a very truncated sense here. They talk about kind of two sides to leadership role, and one is that real empathic, caring, listening leader, and the one is the one that is more directive and instead of saying, okay, now I've heard everything. Now I am going to make a choice here and be a little bit more directive in my leadership. And then we're comfortable with one or the other. And while I love the premise, and I think it's true, I think that the truly caring leadership has both aspects of that because you need to have the time when you care enough to just really listen and be empathetic and to engage and to build relationship in depth. And sometimes you need to care enough to also tell people something true that is hard to hear about their own behavior or performance. But if you don't, lying to them is no good. I know I've had employees in the past that have made the very difficult decision that I needed to let go from an organization, and they were very upset. They're very angry about it. And I've had a number of them that have come back and said, "Thank you, because I was not my best in this organization. I found where I was my best and I needed that feedback," or ones who have had the difficult feedback and have said, "I actually needed to hear that." And there's a lot of love in telling people things that are difficult to hear if you do it from the perspective of caring about them and not from a perspective of superiority. So caring leadership shows up in a lot of different interactions. It's not all just warm milk and cookies and puppies though.
Yeah, that's right. And I think maybe that's where there's a bit of a myth that caring leaders are soft and people can get away with anything. And as you said, that's not at all the case. None of the people that have worked for me or with me would ever say that I was soft from that point of view. Work needed to be done. I had pretty high standards. I still do. I like to meet deadlines. I like to deliver an excellent results. Everybody understood that, but that doesn't mean that you have to whip somebody along to get them to do great work. Sometimes it's just a matter of helping them understand what they need, additional training, or a little bit of coaching. There's especially some people who are quiet, I find, introverts, they sometimes need a little bit of help. And all of a sudden, whoops, you've got somebody who was a hidden gem and now is a star on your team. Like I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I've seen it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just, the title of my book, by the way, so for the audience who don't know it, it's called Empowering People Through Caring Leadership Strategies That Actually Work. So empowering people through caring leadership, and it's very powerful. And people ask me why I wrote it, which I've explained already, but I purposely only went to a select number of key topics that I knew impacted people today. And I first explained what I mean by caring leadership, my architect of people first, a principle that I created. But I talk about leaders as coaches. That I have a whole chapter on leaders as a coach, and that's really critical. And then I talk about motivating, inspiring people, developing them, dealing with multi-generational teams, dealing with future of work and hybrid remote and the changing work relationship, especially with the younger generations coming. The work relationship is changing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I have a whole chapter on what I call dealing with tough stuff. And it does cover what you touched on, having to have difficult situations, discussions, having to let people go. I've been through mergers and acquisition 3 times. They're a challenge, let me tell you. And they're a challenge for the team, right? If you think about it. I've been through the dot-com bust, the impact of the September 9/11 attacks on our business, which was huge, the 2009 recession, and then the pandemic as well, right? That's in a nutshell what I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
And I'll stop here for a minute, but I find that a lot of it relates to the way you deal with transformation in your work.
Ah, okay. What do you see as the big kind of key connection there?
The key connection is that, and even in the title of your book, you say the heart of transformation, but it's really about the human capabilities, right? You don't talk about providing better systems, better tools. You talk about making people, enabling people, right?
Yeah.
And the whole thing is you can look at a transformation strictly from a business point of view. Here's the business objective. Let's do it. But if you don't look at the people side of the equation, you're going to have a lot of problems.
Yeah, I agree, and I obviously I agree, and thank you for saying that. And we do come at that from a very similar perspective. It's interesting. I actually had an introductory call this morning with someone who I met through a mutual friend and colleague, and is based over in Europe, and has actually brought things like hypnotherapy and some other things into his practice. But
Mm.
he is working with individuals and saying, look, really healthy individuals who are clear about who they are and what they want to do and who they want to be and what their purpose is are really perform the best. What's interesting about them is that for some of them, it may end up they leave the role they're in, which you say, how is that good if people then leave their job? How are we getting more performance? They're struggling because they're not in the right role and they may be performing, but it's burning them out. And then all of a sudden they're just done, or their effectiveness drops because they get burnt out. And if they're not in the right place, there's only so long. I do believe in the aspect of fake it till you make it sometimes when you're trying to do something, just get in there and do it like you know what you're doing and learn. But there's only so long you can fake something that is truly not who you are or who you were meant to be or who you want to be. And the work I do, I'm working now with a new organization and they're looking at me and said, look, we need help with our change management. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, uh-oh. And we started talking and I said, look, you don't need help with change management and Gantt charts and propaganda plans to tell people the new thing is the good thing. What you need is change as a capability. I said, we got to build that very individually. And they said, well, how do we start working with these people? I said, we start by working with you. And they're like, what do you mean working with us? No, you as the leadership group here, you have to understand how to change. You have to be able to share your stories of where you have changed your mind, learned something, was wrong, found something out, figured something out, got better, because you telling those stories as their leader makes it safe for them to have and tell their stories and to not be right all the time. If you're the infallible leader, then they say the only way to be a leader is to be infallible, and nobody is. And we set up this kind of vicious cycle, and they're really starting to get it now that their role is in leading change, is in their own change, and then how they share and express that with people to create a safe space for them to do the same at all levels in the organization where the changes are happening and impacting the business, whether they're systems or process or technology changes, whatever they may be. It's the human capacity to actually engage in that change dialogue safely that allows us to figure out how to move through that change.
Yeah. Oh, that's really great. And that's the kind of work that is so important. I remember you wrote something probably 4 or 5 years ago around the transformational leaders. And it's similar to what you're talking about now. I get asked about change management too often, but I always say that's not really what I do. I can help you with change leadership because that's what you need first, right? And so start with the person, but also I always emphasize how will you bring your people on, not just to simply get buy-in for the purpose of getting buy-in, but engage them early and then let them help you understand what's a good way to go forward because usually the people in the field and the managers all across the levels, they have a better understanding of the problems or some hidden patterns that may impact performance. And if you don't know about these hidden patterns, a transformation may miss them. So you really have to engage the people early. And then if the leader is really sold on the idea and passionate, then I think the people will follow along. A former client of mine called it modeling from the top. This whole
Hmm.
idea transformational leaders, right? Change leadership, model from the top. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's similar to modeling from the top is what I refer to as leading out loud in the book and in my work. And it's interesting you bring up like mergers and acquisitions because that is one thing that can really drive a big change. And I have a client I'm working with that is they're a new company created by bringing together some other companies, a startup, an established piece of a business, something else. They can combine them all into a new entity. And I talked to them about their journey. And I said, so when this idea first came up, all of you thought this is the best idea ever. No, we had some concerns. We had this. And so we started talking about the journey they went through to get to the point where now they're all bought in. And I said, so how long did that take? That was over a process, 8 months, 9 months, a year. I said, okay, now you're here and you want everybody behind you, below you to be here. How long have they been exposed to this? A month. Oh, so is it fair that you had a year and they've had a month? We don't have a year. I said, no, you don't, but you needed to start engaging earlier. We can't make it take a whole year. We've got to truncate that some, but they still need time to go through everything that you went through just at their level and their application and their part of the business they're contributing to. Said you have this belief that all of a sudden, because you're there, everyone has gone through the same journey. But have you made it safe for them to go through that journey? Have we created a place? And so that's one of the things we're doing now, right? Is creating conversations where people can disbelieve, can say, here's my doubts and concerns, can say, here's why I think this aspects of this might not work. And then really talk that through and have a moment to, because when they do that, then they start to also see, but here's why it might work. And then they have a chance to look at their assumptions and make some changes. But it is interesting. We tend to be very focused on where our head is at. And as leaders, one of the one of the things we can do that can be the most hearing, I think, to empower people as leaders is to remember that they have to go through the same things we went through and to remember what we've gone through. We often forget that. It's like when we learn something and we realize something new, we're almost embarrassed by not having known it all along. And so we want to act like this is obviously always the way it's been when it's brand new to us too.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah, I've been to 3 mergers and acquisitions, and I do talk about them in my book. The most brutal was the last one because we were a medium-sized software company bought by a huge, huge software company, and they were all about process. People were secondary. Okay, this is how we do things around here. You do it. Very little in terms of interaction. These are our new procedures, long, long emails. Okay, just follow the email and that's it. Man, that was a struggle. And I went over with the whole team. So it was a struggle to keep them as well. And I had a few battles, but actually after a while, I did gain a lot of respect and credibility. And we were quite successful, but it wasn't that easy. And the next acquisition they made, they asked me to talk to the people coming on board kind of say, here's what to expect and here's what you can do. And but it's still about leading change. It's about leading the people through the change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so true. And one of the mistakes that large successful organizations make is that we attribute we attribute success to everything we've done, and we don't actually look at the aspects of it that are just being at the right time and place. And there's a lot of other factors that we don't control that contribute to success. But then we start to say they're the biggest, they're the most successful right now monetarily. Their way must be the right way. And then they begin to acquire entities and say, you have to come over to our way of doing it, not realizing that as they grow, some of the things there's limitations that they imposed upon themselves, but they still grew faster than everyone because in many senses they got lucky or their timing was right. But they start to think that all those aspects of what they do contributed to that, whereas they don't see the ones that detracted because it's really hard to see missed opportunity is what was done or not done, what was delivered or not delivered. And for those organizations then to come in and say, as a point of strength, we're buying you, but we don't really want you to influence us. We want to influence you. It's just it's a bit of hubris. And when we, as organizational leaders, and we start to say, look, let's just obviously there are some things that are embedded in our systems and ways of working that unless they can be shown to be really detrimental, we're probably going to keep because they're working right now. But let's be open. Let's be open when the people are thinking what they're saying and listen to them and at least allow to have a conversation where they challenge some of those beliefs. And sometimes I've been in organizations that have had to say, you know what? The way that you and the acquired entity do it is actually a little bit better, but the cost of getting there to us right now is something that we can't pay. And so you're going to have to go backwards a little bit for us all to go forwards later. But those are the kind of mature conversations that we often don't have, and they threaten us. It's threatening to say, our way of doing it isn't the best way, but for these reasons, we're going to stick with it now because the cost of changing it may be too high. That's perfectly legitimate, but it starts to make the acquiring entity feel weakened. So anyway, I know maybe I'm off on a bit of a
Yeah.
tangent, but there are interesting dynamics.
No, oh, tons, tons. And it changes over time too. I don't know if you've worked with Gen Z and millennials. I have. I've worked with people across the board, all the way up to senior boomers and what we call perennials now. Not sure if you're familiar with that term, but anyway, those of us who never want to stop working because the perennials, we're always around. We always continue. But when you look at Gen Z and millennials, they really want to understand what is the purpose of the organization? Does it align with their values? Do they belong there? Is this a right job for them? And also, they want feedback, regular feedback. Some ask every day, how am I doing? How am I doing? Just in the early stages. But if I remember back when I started, I had tons to learn.
Hmm.
Sure, I studied computer science. Okay. But your first job, you don't start writing code. You've got to learn how to work with people and how is work assigned and how does the leadership work across the up the chain and everything else. So there's a lot to learn about working with multi-generational groups, multifunctional groups. I've led both types at the same time and multicultural group, of course, because particularly in the tech sector, we work with people from across the world and it doesn't really matter. So how
Right.
do you fit all of that in your transformation projects with your clients?
I think one of the things is the great equalizer is when people just talk to each other and listen to each other. And it's interesting. Some of the stuff with the millennial generation coming into the workforce is that I think a lot of uh, their kind of core ways of being and looking for meaning and going a bit deeper. What's interesting is that it's the success the generations before them that has allowed them to get to that place in many ways and be free to move up Maslow's hierarchy. If we go back to that old model, but it doesn't mean they're right about everything. They're also still new to business, and it doesn't mean that everything is going to change immediately. And some of them can be very frustrated with the old grizzled white guys still in charge of many organizations not getting it. But at the same time, those people have been successful. And so when you start that conversation, and that's one thing I've seen. I remember one of the things I really liked that when I was at GE that Jeff Immelt did is he started to end up creating what became I can't remember what they called it, but some sort of advisory council. But he would meet monthly with people from across the organization from very different generations. And it wasn't where they would tell him how it should be. It wasn't where he told them how it should be. They just had a dialogue and someone would say, I think we should do X, Y, Z. He said, let's talk about that because from my perspective, here's what I love about that. And here's what makes it hard. And he would bring the realities of the context they were in to bear. And they would say, I said, now he'd say, don't get defeated by that, but let's think about how do we work through this and how do we bring others along? Because as much as you don't want to be forced to see it a different way than you see it, neither do they. So we have to talk about this. We have to find the common ground. We have to find the things that, that make sense for everyone. And we have to recognize that some people have different principles or values than us that aren't wrong or bad. Now, some of them do have very bad principles and values, but most of them, they just have a different agenda or different needs or different circumstances. And we have to be able to have that dialogue. And I guess to answer the question for me, is giving people tools to engage in conversation. I truly believe if you want to change the world, you change the conversation. And it is in my work and reflected in the book as well. One of the things I do is I provide a lot of questions and how to introduce and ask and answer and listen to the answers of and talk about the answers of those questions, believing that engaging in that dialogue is actually the different behavior that we need to put in place that leads to change. So yeah, again, for me, it's get people talking across the gaps are only big when we're talking about groups of people. One on one, can become much smaller because two people can find commonality and common ground and common meeting, and then a small group can do the same, which is why in organizations I work with, or even in big transformation projects, we say it's individual and small group based. And we'll start with a few places and learn how it works best in those small places in a large organization before we try and then share that with the rest of the organization and allow people the time to have the dialogue.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's exactly the way to go. In my book, I write about that, and I say they want a voice, right? All of the generations want a voice. And actually, maybe all the generations think that they're better than the previous one, but at least you want a voice, right? So you can, oh, okay, I have this opinion or I have this concern. Just taking the time to listen to them one on one makes a big difference. Sometimes as a
Mhm.
group, but sometimes one on one. And I found it was the same with mergers and acquisition. If I was able to get in front of a more senior leader and talk one on one, it changed the dynamic completely, completely.
Yeah.
And one went from being, reputation was that he was very tough. People feared him, blah, blah, blah. And I volunteered to join one of his projects, take a bit of a risk, but anyway, and we ended up with a great relationship at the end, right? Super, it worked. But then in that environment, he took the time to listen. I listened to hear what he wanted to do, and we found a common ground easily, easily.
Yeah.
Well, it boils down to that, right? Yeah,
Yeah. It does.
yeah. Do you find that women leaders are better at that kind of thing than men in general? Or maybe that's too much of a broad statement, but women leaders basically are very good at sensing if there's a problem or somebody's uncomfortable, or maybe having a sense of how a certain change might impact the people. Do you run into that in your organization, in your work?
I do. And it's funny, of all the different theories of leadership and organization and management and business success I've read, when they come to actually gathering data and evidence, there's very little. But, and I need to actually look the studies up because I made this comment for some time and I don't have the study at hand anymore. But the data seems to show that the more women you have in leadership, the more successful a company is. And I think it is, and maybe it goes back to there was the classic, and if you remember the Lawrence Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan, and the whole discussion about moral reasoning, but Kohlberg was a psychologist and he basically posed this question or this example. It was your spouse is dying from an illness, but there's this medicine that will save them, but you can't afford it and the insurance won't cover it. You can't get it, but you're given the opportunity to steal it and get away with it. Will you steal it or not? And he said men would either have a reason for why they'd steal it or why they wouldn't. And the women would say, well, wait a minute, no, this doesn't, I don't like the setup. And so his statement in his writing was, and therefore men are morally superior. Their moral reasoning is superior because we know how to make a choice and reason, and these women just don't. And then Carol Gilligan came along and looked at the work and they said, maybe not, because you're taking this entirely flawed situation and just accepting it and then saying, now I'll react, as opposed to saying, let us change the situation in the context, which is actually a reflection of higher moral reasoning. And I think that while I've obviously never been female, that there is an experience of having to, or just naturally taking a look at a world that maybe over the years, not maybe over the years, has been less kind to if you're female, has developed in women a sense of saying, let's change the circumstances. Let's not just accept them as they are. And I think in many organizations where we fall short is we accept the circumstances of the organization as if they're this immutable force. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people about change and transformation and saying, if we do this, there's these guardrails and guidelines and structures that are in the way. Okay, who created those? We did. Well, what's the law that says you have to keep them? There is no law. That's just how it works here.
Yeah.
So why can't you change them? Because they're there. And just the fact that they created them, they couldn't really realize they could recreate them or tear them down. So I know that answers your question, but to me, I find that in general, the more females you have, in leadership roles, the better the diversity of thought and the better the ability or the desire to not accept things as they're given, but to question the nature of them and say, let's change it from the fundamentals. Let's just not react to what we have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I found the same. I've had excellent bosses, and some of them have been women, including my last boss at Oracle. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I worked for a short while at another software company. My boss was an SVP, and the president was a woman SVP. The president was a woman. And the way they reacted or viewed the pandemic and the implications was exemplary, probably the best around. They just knew we got to take care of our people first. And what maybe the business will suffer a little bit, okay, for a little while, but take care of our people first, and it made a huge difference. And in the teams that I've led, I more often found men were overrated in terms of how their performance was rated. Men were more often overrated, and women were more often underrated, and often, again, those hidden gems that I've talked about before. So in my book, I do talk quite a bit about that, and when you think of caring leadership, women tend to be naturally caring leaders or caring, right? They have those natural tendencies, abilities, and to me, that's a skill. Caring leadership should be seen as a positive skill for everyone, but it's certainly a positive skill that women can leverage. My book is not about telling people, you're broken, let me fix you. The book is,
Right.
okay, here's an example of how this works. And I love your idea of questions in your book. I do have some questions. I give bullet points, but I ask coaching questions, which will help leaders be better leaders and better coaches to develop their people.
Yeah. I think the one final thought maybe on the gender aspect of it or the male female aspect or whatever groups you may have. It's not there still isn't a place and a value for us older white guys with some gray hair in there because we do have a lot to contribute. As long as we don't, what's been challenging is when you become secure in your place of power or safety, especially at the top, then you start to believe your own hype. And I've seen wonderful leaders who are really good at what they did, but they just got too comfortable with everyone saying, "You're it, boss. You're the greatest. Look at what you've done. Look at the size of this company. Look at what it does." And you start to believe your own hype that, again, you've got it figured out. And that's what I think that we need to do, especially if I'm talking to male executives. And I work with male and female executives. With male executives, look, all of them, the one thing I'll say the same is you don't have it all figured out. And you can't because as much as you figured out right now, tomorrow the world's going to be different and you have to keep figuring it out. And you need to rely on people of different genders, different generations, whatever it may be, to see clearly what's going on and then make the choices you need to make to be better from where you're at. And I don't make any blanket statements about who can be a great leader. And I don't think that necessarily, I think men can be obviously really good leaders, but they have to be open to the fact that they're not going to be the better leader just because they're men.
No, and they can't do it alone. And so humility is a virtue, but you can't do it alone. Nobody can do it alone.
I was just going to say, I think that is and probably as we're getting close to the end of that's a great point to maybe bring home is that you can't do it alone. And that, I guess that's, maybe people say, of course you want to say that's what your work is. And that's true. But I know that the time I have with the clients that I coach, work with most closely, especially is that they are some of the ones that are the most accomplished and the most successful are the ones who have said, I need help. I can't do it alone. And we have created in our society and our organizations this myth that if we hire you into this big job with this big fat salary and all these big fat stock options and this big fat title, that you better deliver you and don't be asking for help. When you've got your team, unfortunately, no matter how close you are to them, you have power over them and you have power over their resources and their future. And so it's almost impossible for people working for you not to have some agenda of their own when they're talking to you. So you need help from people that have no other agenda than they care about you to allow you to figure out how to be the right kind of caring leader who empowers people. But if you don't have that help, it doesn't mean you have to hire consultants like me or coaches like you or I, but it means you have to find those people where you've taken away as much as you can that power dynamic and where you are willing to be open and explore and accept and get and give help in the same way in order for you to continue to grow to be successful as a leader, no matter where you are in your leadership career.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's a quote I have in my book that says that you can get people to work for you, but you need to win their hearts to have them work with you. And I think that's a fabulous quote at the beginning of my book. But anyway, I want to thank you, Michael. So where can people reach you if they want to find you?
Michael Leckie, MichaelLeckie.com. MichaelLeckie.com is my website and kind of access to the book and everything is all there. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And anyone who's watching this, if you watched it, say, hey, saw you on Germain's podcast, connect on LinkedIn. I'm very good about that as well.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Same with me. People can find me on LinkedIn. I have my own website, which is my name, GermainSt-Denis.ca. And my book is coming out. Actually, by the time the discussion airs, my book will have been out January 15th. And someone said I should sell 1,000,000 copies. So there we go. That's
Excellent.
the target. Thank you,
Excellent.
Michael.
It's always a pleasure, Germain.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And maybe we'll do this again some other time.